When people hear the word nuclear, they imagine a mushroom cloud. That's not how nuclear crises usually begin. They begin with clocks, with thresholds, with a series of moves that don't look like war until one day you realize the options are gone. And that's why this headline combination is so dangerous. Iran's hardliners signaling a new red line posture at the same time the world is dealing with the possibility that the Strait of Hormuz stays closed or effectively unusable. One is about strategic fear, the other is about economic oxygen. Put them together and you get a countdown environment, where every hour adds pressure, and pressure makes mistakes more likely. Let's be precise about what we can say and what we can't. Unless there's verified reporting of a specific step, an official policy change, a confirmed nuclear decision, a documented change in access for inspectors, then we should treat crossed the red line as a claim about signaling, not a confirmed fact about a weapon. But signaling is not harmless. In nuclear brinkmanship, signaling is part of the weapon system. It's how you shape an adversary's choices without firing a shot. Now add Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It's a global compression point. In normal conditions, roughly a fifth of globally traded oil transits that corridor, along with a major share of Gulf energy exports and commercial shipping. That doesn't mean the world runs out of oil instantly if Hormuz is disrupted. It means the world becomes fragile to risk. Markets price fear. Insurers price uncertainty. Shipping companies reroute or hesitate, and hesitation is where costs begin. So when you see a title like Nuclear Alert, Iran's hardliners push past a red line, what if Hormuz doesn't reopen? The real meaning is this: what happens if the conflict stops being manageable in two separate lanes, security and commerce, and merges into one combined crisis? Because a prolonged Hormuz disruption doesn't just raise prices, it internationalizes the conflict. It forces countries that want to stay neutral to pick behaviors, reroute, escort, sanction, mediate, because they're paying the bill. And a nuclear escalation signal, real or perceived, doesn't just scare policymakers. It compresses their timelines. It creates now or never thinking. That's how miscalculation starts. This is the core dynamic. Hormuz is leverage over the world. Nuclear signaling is leverage over decision-making. If both levers are pulled at once, you don't get a clean negotiation environment. You get a high-pressure room where everyone starts acting on worst-case assumptions. So in this briefing, I'm going to break down what hardliners crossing a red line typically means in practice, what Hormuz staying closed can mean even without a formal shutdown, why the two reinforce each other, and the three paths this can take next. Because nuclear alert isn't a single event. It's the moment a crisis becomes a clock. Let's define the red line in a way that's useful, not dramatic. In nuclear standoffs, red lines are rarely one clear boundary like they built a bomb. They're usually a ladder of steps that change the breakout equation, how quickly a country could, if it chose, move from capability to weaponization. Depending on what is publicly reported at any given time, pushing past a red line can mean moves like raising enrichment level or expanding enriched stockpiles beyond prior understandings, installing or operating more advanced centrifuges, increasing output potential, reducing transparency, limiting inspector access, slowing cooperation, or restricting monitoring, hardening facilities and dispersing key components, making a potential strike less effective. More aggressive official rhetoric that hints at capability or intent, even without admitting it. Not all of these mean a bomb decision has been made, but each one changes the strategic math for everyone else, and hardliners, almost by definition, prefer moves that create leverage and ambiguity because ambiguity forces opponents to assume the worst. Now, here's why hardliners matter specifically in a live war environment. They raise the political cost of compromise. Negotiations require face-saving and flexibility. Hardliners win influence when they can portray flexibility as weakness. That doesn't mean diplomacy is impossible. It means diplomacy becomes more procedural, more indirect, and more dependent on intermediaries, because direct public concessions become toxic. And that's where Hormuz enters the same equation. A closed Hormuz can exist in multiple forms. Official closure, claims that may or may not be fully enforced. Practical disruption, harassment risk, drone missile threat environment, boarding threats, mine fears. Commercial closure, insurance premiums spike, advisories harden, shipping companies delay or reroute. This matters because the world doesn't wait for a legal declaration to react. It reacts when ships hesitate. So picture the combined pressure stack. Hardliners signal escalation or reduced nuclear restraint. Policymakers feel time shrinking. Hormuz disruption raises global economic pressure. Third parties demand stabilization. More pressure produces more signaling. Signaling produces more fear. Fear raises the odds of preemptive or overreactive moves. That's the loop. It doesn't require anyone to want a wider war. It only requires enough actors to believe they can't afford to wait. And there's a narrative layer that supercharges all of this: legitimacy. Everyone tries to frame their moves as defensive and lawful, and the other side's moves as illegitimate. Hardliners thrive in that environment because legitimacy battles reward maximal language, red lines, no compromise, unacceptable, piracy, terror, self-defense. Once those words dominate, leaders lock themselves into positions that are harder to reverse quietly. This is why the phrase, "what if Hormuz doesn't reopen?" is not just about oil prices. It's about whether the global system begins to treat this crisis as structural, not temporary. If the world believes Hormuz can stay functionally disrupted for weeks instead of days, you get second-order effects: inventory hoarding, refinery adjustments, emergency releases, rerouting, and political pressure in capitals far from the Gulf. Meanwhile, nuclear signaling changes the risk tolerance of militaries operating in the region. When the strategic stakes feel higher, rules of engagement tighten, threat perception rises, and ambiguous contacts become more dangerous. In other words, the sea becomes a trigger environment. So the key is not whether one headline sounds worse than another. The key is how the two interact. Hormuz creates economic urgency. Nuclear signaling creates strategic urgency. Together, they create a clock that politicians can't ignore. Now let's talk outcomes. Because in high-stakes crises, you don't need perfect information to identify the most likely paths. You need to understand incentives and constraints. Path 1, managed reopening. Plus controlled nuclear messaging, stabilization under pressure. In this scenario, Hormuz becomes usable again, maybe not normal, but functional, and nuclear rhetoric is dialed down just enough to create diplomatic space. That doesn't mean trust exists. It means key stakeholders decide the cost of sustained disruption is too high, and they quietly install pressure valves, deconfliction channels, limited understandings, and restrained operational behavior. What it looks like: shipping begins moving more predictably. Insurance costs stop climbing. Official language shifts from threats to procedures, channels, technical talks, framework, avoiding misunderstandings. Nuclear messaging becomes less theatrical and more conditional. Why it happens? Because even actors who benefit from leverage often fear losing control of the leverage. If the global backlash becomes too strong, pressure turns into isolation. Path 2, Hormuz. Open in name, closed in pricing, the slow choke. This is the most common modern outcome because it preserves leverage while avoiding the responsibility of full closure. Traffic moves, but with friction. The corridor becomes a high-risk lane where shipping companies operate with delays, higher premiums, and convoy-like behavior. Meanwhile, nuclear signaling remains elevated, not necessarily new, hard steps, but enough ambiguity to keep pressure alive. What it looks like: repeated advisories, intermittent incidents, elevated escort posture, daylight transits, holding patterns outside the strait, market volatility that spikes on rumors and calms on reassurances, never returning to baseline. Why it happens? Because it lets a state apply pressure without taking the extreme step that could trigger a unified international response. Path 3, a catalytic incident. Pulls hardened nuclear posture, snap escalation. This is the dangerous path. It can begin with something that seems small: a boarding, a drone strike, a misread radar track, an accident at sea. In an environment already saturated with nuclear rhetoric and economic fear, the incident doesn't stay small. Leaders feel compelled to respond publicly. Hardliners gain influence, and nuclear posture becomes a shield. You can't push us too far. What it looks like: sudden halt in shipping or sharp drop in traffic, emergency meetings, expanded escort operations, rapid, absolutist statements, a cycle of action and retaliation where each side claims the other forced the move. Why it happens? Because crisis environments punish patience, they reward speed. And speed is the enemy of verification. Now let's address the nuclear piece directly, because this is where people either underreact or overreact. A nuclear alert moment does not automatically mean a weapon is imminent, but it does mean decision makers believe the strategic margin is shrinking, and that belief shapes behavior. It can lead to increased intelligence and surveillance activity, more aggressive maritime posture, faster retaliation cycles, reduced tolerance for ambiguous threats, higher probability of preemptive moves. In other words, even if the nuclear reality hasn't changed dramatically, the risk environment changes because leaders start acting like it has. So the question, what happens if Hormuz stays closed, becomes bigger. It's not just a supply shock. It becomes a strategic accelerator. The longer a choke point crisis lasts, the more likely it is to trigger policy moves that are hard to reverse. Sanctions escalation, coalition escorts, expanded rules of engagement, and hardened negotiating positions. And once those moves are in place, reopening Hormuz doesn't reset the crisis. It just shifts it into a new phase. one where the baseline mistrust is higher than it was before. Here's what you should watch in the next 24 to 72 hours if you want to know which path we're on. Because in choke point plus nuclear signal crises, the real indicators show up in behavior, not headlines. First, watch commercial shipping behavior. Are tankers transiting in steady numbers, or are they clustering outside the corridor? Are there signs of systematic delays, route hesitation, or ships going dark on tracking for perceived safety? You don't need perfect data, just look for pattern shifts. In maritime crises, the private sector is the earliest truth signal. Second, watch insurance and maritime advisory language. When advisories move from elevated caution to avoid transit, that's functional closure even if officials deny it. Premiums are how fear becomes policy. Third, watch naval posture messaging. Escorts, security corridors, expanded patrol announcements, and changes in rules of engagement language tell you whether this is being managed or whether both sides are preparing for collision. Stabilizing posture comes with deconfliction messaging. Escalatory posture comes with absolutist rhetoric. Fourth, watch diplomatic intermediaries. When stabilization is real, intermediaries talk like engineers. Mechanisms, technical teams, and frameworks avoid misunderstandings. When escalation is coming, everyone starts talking like prosecutors. Violations, piracy, illegal, consequences, red lines. Fifth, watch verifiable nuclear transparency signals, not rumors. Any confirmed shift in inspector access, monitoring arrangements, or official nuclear policy language is more important than vague claims about crossing lines. The most meaningful nuclear escalations are usually bureaucratic and technical, not theatrical. Now let's bring it back to the title. What if Hormuz doesn't reopen? The answer is not one dramatic event. It's a compounding system effect. Day 1, fear premium rises. Day 3, routing and insurance behavior changes. Day 7, political pressure mounts in importing countries. Day 14, emergency policies become normalized. And throughout, every naval interaction becomes more dangerous because the strategic stakes feel higher. That's why choke points are so powerful. They turn time into a weapon, and nuclear signaling turns time into panic. So if hardliners are pushing the rhetoric and Hormuz stays functionally closed, the world's biggest risk is not a single strike. It's the loss of control, the moment where leaders stop managing the crisis and start reacting to it. Because once that reaction cycle begins, the red line stops being a metaphor. It becomes a set of decisions taken under pressure with imperfect information in a system where the cost of being wrong is enormous,